from a nation that for a powerful long time has in war and peace been an ally and a friend of the United States of America. Can I present to you Mr. John Wyld, the President of the Cattle Council of Australia. John.
Thank you, Governor Bill Janklow. Let me say what a privilege it is to be here today to address such a great gathering. I'd like to congratulate you also for calling together this conference, because the best thing we can have when times are tough, and they're as tough in Australia as they are here, is good information. Now, I've got a range of people here today. We're going to share that information. I'm going to learn a lot, and I hope everybody else here today learns a lot. Just like to put on the first slide now. You might think I've mucked up there, but I just thought you'd ought to realise we are down under, and it is summer and everything's different, and I hope you'll forgive my bit of jet lag. But really today that Bill asked us to ask questions, or for you to ask questions or to question each other. And when it was suggested we might be a threat to Australia might be a threat to the US, I just respond that we're all in the same industry. We're nowadays in the global market, and we really can't separate each other out, and we're all together. And I'd like to demonstrate that today as we work through. Bill said I'm the President of the Cattle Council. That's a producer organisation. It's voluntary funded. We're a single national voice. We have state organisations, and we have about 5 staff based in Canberra. Our promotion and research is done through the Australian Meat and Livestock Corporation, which is check-off funded, and we pay about $3 a head as producers, but the packers also pay an equal share, and we raise about $50 or $60 million each year to spend on promotion and research and development. What I'd like to do today is give you a bit of a perspective of where Australia is, what we're doing, what the industry looks like, where it came from. I'd like to talk a bit about the world market, and from our perspective I'd like to deal with Australia's trade with the US, which is what you probably want to listen to, and then talk about the challenges we all need to meet together and a little bit about the future. Australia, of course, was discovered by Captain Cook in 1776. He claimed it for Britain. It became an independent country at Federation in 1900, but we still retain the Queen as head of state. The first fleet is a bit faint, it probably was in those days. That was convict settlement, 11 ships, about 5 head of cattle. First settlements were pretty crude affairs. They were always short of food, and cattle became very important, not only for food, but as beasts of burden. They were used as bullocks to pull carts, and Australia was very quickly developed. The first cattle came in about the 1820s. They were mainly shorthorns, Herefords, British breeds. Nowadays, of course, we've got a whole range of breeds, still based a lot on British breeds in the south and a lot of Bos Indicus in the north. Our industry has always been based on grass. It covers 61% of the land mass of Australia. 90% of our turnoff is based on grass production, not grain production. Across the northern part of Australia, there's a range of climates there, probably similar to your southern part of the country. And I say based mainly on Bos Indicus breeds. They're there for survival. They're there to cope with the heat. Across the southern parts, again, that's mainly the temperate part, more like probably South Dakota, probably not as cold as this. But we've got a lot of crosses, a lot of composites between Brahman and any breed you like to mention, in that effort to try and make sure we maximise the production off the grass. We even have snow in Australia, believe it or not. There's more snow in my home state than there is in Switzerland at the other time of year. The cattle numbers, concentration is in Queensland. We've got 10 million head of cattle there, as I say, based mainly on Bos Indicus breeds. Across the south, we've got 6 million, New South Wales, 4 million Victoria, etc. But our herd numbers have stayed remarkably static. That goes back to 1988. It's forecast out to 1999. We don't anticipate any major changes. We've had 4 years of drought in Queensland and New South Wales, and that's retarded any growth. But as Mr. Peterson was saying, we're now producing more beef off the same size herd as we were back in the 1970s, which is a similar situation to what you face. The big changes that have happened over the last 10 years have been the development of feedlots to satisfy the demand in North Asia. And we've been able to share a lot of knowledge with your feedlot sector. This happens to be a Japanese-owned feedlot, Ranges Valley. And you can see they're using all the modern technology to protect the environment and animal welfare practices. A lot of Angus cattle in our feedlots to service the Japanese market, but also a lot of Brahman-based cattle. There's always a big argument about is the beef the same, and the research shows clearly that if it's treated well and it's handled well, the beef can shape up just the same. We've got a whole range of different sorts of animals. Somebody asked me last night about Murray Grey. That's a Murray Grey. And they were developed in the Murray River region in Victoria about a century ago. And they are also very suitable for the Japanese trade. Our feedlot capacity has grown in response to that demand from North Asia. And you can see, and that only goes back to 91, there's been a tremendous change. And it's tailed off a bit lately as older feedlots have been phased out. But the sad fact is, and I think Bill Gates designed those cows on the left, but don't worry about those, but you can see we've got about 850,000 head capacity, and yet at June this year we're only occupying 42%, and currently I think we're down to 39% utilisation of our feedlot capacity, and that's a mixture of poor returns, low margins, low cattle prices. The other big change we've seen is a change into live exports of live cattle, mainly out of the port of Darwin in the north. They're picked up off the farm in big road trains. They transported long distances up to the port of Darwin. There's a constant procession of trucks. There's a ship every day, sometimes two ships. They carry about 1,000 to 2,500 head of cattle each. And they're mainly servicing the near markets. It's a pretty efficient operation in terms of the cattle come straight off the property, they're marshalled and shipped straight alongside the ship. And that's grown very dramatically over the last few years. Back in '92 there was hardly any, it was a pretty ad hoc sort of a trade, but you can see how it's rocketed along. It's now worth $300 million, about 600,000 head going out, and that's really revolutionised Northern Australia. It's really put a big floor in that market. If we look at where the cattle are going to, mainly Indonesia, 48% for fattening, Philippines, some breeding cattle go out, but they're mainly going into the Philippines. Just to break up the total production in Australia, the red part at the bottom, that's projected out to the year 2000. We're about where that dip is at the moment. You can see that domestic market is still our largest and biggest market. North American exports are the yellow part, and the green part is North Asia, and the bit in between is a myriad of other markets. We service about 50 countries, but in relatively small quantities. Like here, we're dependent on very few markets that represent real value and real price. But just turning to the world scene, it's quite intriguing looking at where the cattle are in the world, and you can see India's the biggest rancher around. They've got 26% of the world's beef cattle herd, Australia at 2.5%, United States at 9.9%. But when you look at actual production figures, you get a totally different image. Australia moves from 2.5% to 3.6%, but the US, the real giant of beef production, goes from owning nearly 10% of the cattle to producing 25% of the beef. Enormous production off the numbers of cattle, and that tends to be growing. European Union's changes quite dramatically too, but a lot of other countries don't change at all. And if we look at if I might go back just to the technology works, the world's beef production is 47 million tonnes. Now if we look at the amount of beef that's traded, it's 5 million tonnes, and this is the part that drives the world price. And you can see that Australia suddenly becomes the world's largest beef trader, with the United States probably set to overtake Australia within the next 6 months, or certainly 12 months. But this 5 million tonnes part of world trade drives the prices, and it drives them back into all our domestic markets. If we just look at the production statistics, I think we've seen some of these earlier, the Governor was showing them, that US production has climbed, Australian production has stayed remarkably static. This is an intriguing graph that we always had answers for the 1970s crash. We thought we were shut out of markets, but if you look at that graph, it tries to track the difference or the relativity between corn prices and beef production. And you can see when corn prices surged in the 70s, this goes back to 72 right out to the current year, and you can see when corn prices surged against historically high levels, that triggers an immediate surge in production in the US. And then as it comes down here and you're going to herd rebuild. At the moment, we seem to be in the same situation with corn prices at historically high level. That was early in the year. I know things have changed since. The sell-off seemed to precede that to some degree, but nevertheless there's that linkage. If we look at what that does to Australian cattle prices, and this is why I say we're all in the same boat, as the surge in production in the US took place in the 70s, our prices crashed to an all-time low, and we're getting almost into the same situation now. So there's that nexus between production and price. And if you just look at US prices, you've got a similar situation. If we look at the US beef cow slaughter, it is running at high levels, and I gather it's still running pretty well ahead of last year at about 27%. If we look at retail prices, though, it does maybe offer some opportunity there to regain some lost market share, that pork and poultry seem to be rising against the price of beef, and that should present us with some opportunities. But as well as that, those supply side factors, and I might be repeating a lot of what Mr. Peterson was saying earlier, we've had this, I don't remember a time when over a period of 12 months to 2 years, we've had such a surge of poor publicity about the product. We've had the Jack-in-the-Box problem, we had a problem with Metwurst and Frankfurters. There's been the King hit, the BSE, then we've had the summer of E. coli in Japan, where every imported product and even a lot of domestic product was under the microscope, literally. And then we've got all the traditional problems that beef's perceived to be fatty. We've had chemical residue problems, lead shot detections, we've had them, you've had them, and the general background of bad publicity. I know it was referred to earlier, but the tremendous drop in the EU because of the mad cow problem. You can see in Germany their consumption dropped 70% immediately, and it was still down 50-odd% a month later. It's recovered quite a bit now. I think Britain's almost back, but that problem is still there. And that's caused a glut. The EU are now buying beef into intervention stocks yet again. And I think their stocks are up to 500,000 tonnes, and that product will have to come through the market at some stage. I think we all know the result of all that. I don't think I need to labour that. We're all tied together, the prices are coming down, and it's certainly taken the smile off a few of these fellas' faces as they stand around the sale yards discussing the prices. And what I'd like to do now is just talk about the US trade or the US market as far as Australia is concerned. The first point to remember is that we're a long way away and everything has to be transported across the largest ocean in the world. The trade developed because of the synergy between the fat trimmings out of the US feedlot system and our lean beef to make the ideal hamburger patty. So it's a win-win situation. And I know that situation's changed over the last 12 months because of the extra cows being slaughtered in Australia, but it has been the demand in the US that's driven the trade. And I think we all know about how important, and we've already been told that it's 45% of the total consumption here is in the fast food or the ground beef area. If we look at total imports into the US, as the red line, that's total imports, that's Canada, Mexico, Central America, Australia, compared with a base year of 1990 for US production represented by the green line. You can see since 1993 there's been quite a surge in product hitting the market, and that's carcass weight. Now, if we just trim that back to looking at the Australian perspective, Australia represented by the red line, we used to export in 92 nearly between 300 and 400,000 tonnes into the US. That's gradually drifted away down to about 200,000 tonnes. At the same time, we've had this surge of production up to 1.4 million tonnes extra product on the market since 1990. This, of course, has resulted in a surge in exports from US onto world markets. That's projected out to the year 2000 again, but if you look between, say, 90 and 95, where we are now, there's been quite a climb in those exports. I think in 1985 the US exported about 1.4% of production, now it's nearly 8%. And if you convert that to value, it's even more significant. And of course what's happened on that 5 million tonnes on the world market, the most important market of that is Japan. You can see Australia had 53% of that market in 94, 95 we dropped to 48, and now of course we've lost the league leader there. We're down to 44%. The US has taken over as the largest supplier into Japan. But that's been done by severe price competition. It's buying market share. And as Professor Gary Smith says, you can buy market share at a price or a time, but what we have to do is compete on value to the customer rather than simply on price. But that's the situation on that narrow band, and it's pushing the prices down quite severely. But let's just turn away from that for a minute and look at what the real threats are. Food safety. I can't emphasise enough how important we see that as regards our customers' perception of what we're producing. And of course we've got other food choices, we've heard a bit about that, we've got changing preferences, changing lifestyles, the usual opposition from environmental animal welfare lobby, and particularly amongst young females we have rising vegetarianism, which is probably part of the changing preferences. These are the sort of headlines that we can no longer afford, particularly in Australia. We've had this mismatch of regulation. So if we're using a particular drug to kill ticks, it's not registered in the US or Japan, we immediately get a problem. So we've taken quite a lot of action in Australia to try and eliminate those sort of problems. All our meat plants throughout the country will have to be on a HACCP-based system before the end of this year. We're also this week launched an education system down the pipeline, so that we're not only talking to ourselves, we're talking to our customers, we're talking to retail outlets, fast food outlets, and even into the home about hygiene, the washing of hands, etc., etc. And I know you've done all very similar actions. What we have introduced is a system on the farm called Callicrate, which is really no more than a professional beef producer would do anyway, but it's about keeping good records, it's about keeping our chemicals in a proper storage. It's about not selling any animal that is likely to be within a withholding period. We've also introduced voluntarily this year a system of vendor declaration. So every time a lot of animals are sold, you have to fill in a vendor declaration. Now, it's not compulsory, but the packers won't purchase unless there's a vendor declaration. So it's that sort of voluntary arrangement. But it does include all the chemicals or drugs that the animals have been treated with, whether they've been on pastures that have been sprayed within the 60 days, etc. We can also trace back livestock through a tail tag system. But the thing that we really are still working hard on is to get the mismatches eliminated, because whether it's our product coming to the US or your product going into Japan, whilst we've got that lack of harmonisation, we're all at risk. And bad news for beef is exactly that, it's bad news for beef. And our customers don't discriminate particularly, they just don't want the bad news. That's the logo we're using for the cattle care system. It's starting to take a hold. What we're hoping to do is for the packers to respond by starting to appreciate the effort we're making by paying some sort of a premium. But once you mention premiums to packers, you get sometimes quite a negative response about discounts. Now, but I think we all know about other food products, and it's not just chicken, it's the way they convert the other products into our products. Into ground beef, it's ground turkey. We've got fast food outlets that concentrate on chicken. We've even got a product in Australia, you've probably got them here, called Chicken Tonight. It's a sauce that even makes them taste of something. So, these are what our opposition are doing all the time. So, what we've done in Australia is to try and segment our market to find out what's happening. Now that looks a bit busy, but there's this slow erosion constantly of people who appreciate the product being eroded down to people who reject the product. And they go through certain phases. They either appreciate it, they accept it, then they start to resist the product, and then they reject it. And all these sort of comments are the comments we find that people make when you survey target groups. So I don't think I need to read them out. You've all heard them before. They don't want meat so much. It makes them feel full. It's too fat. They don't want to eat a live animal or whatever. So when you try and break that down into which groups you're talking to, this is just a survey of favourite everyday meals. We did other surveys on special occasions, but for everyday meals, until you get to a male over 40 years old, beef doesn't even get a mention. So you're into salads, pastas, chicken, seafood, and that's a serious problem. So what we've tried to do is run two programs, if you like, through our promotion campaign domestically to target the 40-plus male to keep them eating the product, but also to find an excuse for young females to buy beef. And we did a lot of research on the lack of iron in the diet. Most women respond to the idea that they're run down, tired, stressed, overworked, and we can create the problem. And the answer to the problem is to eat beef because you need the iron. And we've had a tremendous response out of that. We've found that people used to think spinach was the best source of iron, and we've got the research to prove that you can't eat enough spinach to get any iron. I mean, if you eat a wheelbarrow load of spinach, you just simply don't get the iron. What you need to eat is lean beef. And therefore, you've got a campaign that gets around I mean, you can't force people to buy something against their innate attitude to the product. So you've got to make them feel good, you've got to get them out there. So 70% now, over 2 years of the campaign, believe that lean beef, or beef, we use lean to get away from the fat image, is the best source. And it's had some really good responses on eating more beef. Now, in the appreciators, of course, it didn't make a lot of difference because they were eating the product anyway, but in the acceptors, 5%. In the resistors, a dramatic change. In the rejectors, some change. So overall, we've seen a rise of people eating more beef, or buying more beef, of 7%. And that's a lot of beef if you take it over the whole population. That's a survey of all females. And of course it's been followed through by magazine, and I have a short video clip that we'll play now, which not only is one of the adverts for addressing the appreciators, there's another one addressing the resistors through the iron campaign, and then there's one of our latest videos, thanks very much, that emphasises the newness and the modernity of the product. So I think it's coming up about now.
You're a catering officer. What's for dinner tonight?
Well, tonight we have something really special. Steak Parmigiana.
Oh.
I take a beautifully lean oyster blade steak, seared and sealed on both sides. And then I sauce it lightly in a mixture of onions, basil, and white wine. And then next to it, I nestle a scoop of tender macaroni tossed with herbs. And alongside that, crunchy snow peas. And then finally, I top off the steak with black olives and melted slices of mozzarella cheese.
Oh. Charlie, you've really excelled yourself this time. Best ever. Isn't it always the way? Right in the middle of dinner.
Today's steak. Can you imagine anything better?
Lean beef is not just a rich source of iron, it also helps you absorb up to 3 times more iron from vegetables and pasta. So you get half your daily iron needs from some lean beef, a few vegetables, and a little pasta. To get half your daily iron needs from the same amount of vegetables without the lean beef, Mamma mia! Lean beef, your best source of essential daily iron.
Ladies and gentlemen, your cabin crew will be serving dinner very shortly. On the menu today, we have delicious beef pesto, a lovely tender steak covered in a wonderful sauce of pesto and sun-dried tomatoes, then thinly sliced and served with fresh al dente pasta, sprinkled with shaved parmesan and served with hot, crusty bread. Of course, that was for business class. Only joking.
Well, that was just a range of the ads. Of course, there's a whole series of them, but that leads me to ask the question, can we be optimistic about the future? And I really believe we can. And the answer is clearly yes. If we look at domestic markets for a start, there is an opportunity, I believe, to look at increasing consumption in the US, and that's a forecast out the year 2000, provided we address these inherent problems that we've talked about earlier. The graph I like to look at, though, is if we look at the export scene, and that's a graph just trying to draw a nexus between per capita income and per capita beef consumption. And there does seem to be that nexus. But if you look at Japan, it's way over here. They're in Australian dollars, but don't worry about that. They're still, the relatives are the same. I think Japan's on about $27,000 a year, similar to the US, but there is a big difference. But we can explain that quite easily. I mean, beef's a traditional food in the US. It's not in Japan, or it is, but it's very expensive. We get a 50% tariff of all beef going in, but inevitably with promotion and activity, we should be able to push that graph up towards the trend line. But if you go back down into South Korea is expected to overtake Australia in terms of per capita income in the next 5 years. It'll be near US within 10 years. They are traditionally beef eaters. If that income goes up, so will their beef consumption, or at least the opportunity to increase beef consumption. We've got to make it happen. It won't fall into our laps, but that opportunity will be there. Similarly, all these countries in the bottom corner, very rapidly growing. Their economies are growing probably the fastest in the world. They will track up that line. And if we try and turn that into individual countries, you can see that that's Japan, still steady growth. A big change there, 1.6 million tonnes up to 1.8 million tonnes. You can look at all these markets. Korea, that's projected out to 2001. One thing I must emphasise, though, we have to work together to make sure these countries do what they agreed to do in the last GATT round. Korea is due to liberalise in 2001. There's currently a conference happening, an APEC conference in Singapore, and there are worrying signs that they want to backslide on those agriculture arrangements. And Australia and the US are working very hard together to keep the pressure on to make sure those reforms take place. Taiwan, a relatively small but still very important market. But if we look at the whole of Asia, other Asia, 7.2 million tonnes currently, going out to 8.5 million tonnes by the year 2001. Enormous amounts of beef will be needed in those countries, or at least the opportunity will be there. But those markets won't, as I say, won't fall into our laps. They're very sophisticated. They're like all markets. There's some suspicion about imported product quite often, particularly in Japan. You can see from the size of the supermarket trolley, though, they wouldn't get too far in Australia. I don't know how big your supermarket trolleys are, but there they shop every day. But they do have a very highly sophisticated domestic beef production system in Japan. This is just a feedlot. They're very neat, very professional feedlots. That's a Wagyu heifer. In this particular feedlot, they only fatten females because of the way the fat's deposited on the carcass. They're fattened for 18 months, I think they're on feed. They go through the Tokyo wholesale market. They probably make between $5,000 and $10,000 a carcass, and they produce high-quality Japanese beef that's very heavily marbled, very white fat, and it's a very highly prized product. Now, we can compete in that market, and you certainly can, but maybe the future lies more in fast food rather than... I just show this as to show you how sophisticated the market can be. That's a melon in a box in the gift-giving season, and that's 15,000 yen. At the time, that was about $150 Australian, about $120 US, just for one simple melon in a box. Now, maybe we don't need to be in that sort of a niche. Maybe we're more into the fast food and the supermarket. I don't know how good your Japanese is, but I think that's a Wendy's. Guess what that is? But this is the growth. This is where we've got to compete, but we must compete on quality with a safe product. We're all in it together. They've got the domestic market. If we can't satisfy them that our product is safe and better and presents better value, well, then these opportunities won't arise. But this is where the marketplace is going to be. Now, we can compete. You promote into that market. This is one of our promotions in that market. We even see promotions run together in the supermarket. So you've got US meth advertising on one side of the same poster and Aussie beef on the other side. So that's to promote imported beef. So what I'd like to say in summary is maybe the current situation where we are is cyclical. We need to really get on top of those safety issues to work together. We're all in the same game. We've got to expand all our markets, whether it's domestic markets or our overseas opportunities. The opportunities are there, it's up to us to capture them. And we need some pretty clear signals. I must say in Australia we do work pretty well with our packers. There's a degree of toing and froing, but on our Meat and Livestock Corporation they're 50-50 represented with us, and we do talk to them a lot because a lot of the things we have to solve are down the chain. It's about grading, it's about feedback, it's about food safety, it's about guaranteeing our product to them, and we do need to work together. By standing back and sort of arguing from a distance, we've got to argue in the same room. We still need the arguments, but we need them face to face and sort it through. I mean, we all know who this guy is. He's out there in the rain. He's a very skilled operator. It takes a lifetime to learn the craft and the skills of being a good stockman. I mean, I think we all have a duty to give this guy a future and us all a future. And I'd really like to thank you by saying that we all are part of one great industry. Thanks very much.